In the spring of 1943, as the first waves of German prisoners of war were transported from the battlefields of North Africa to the shores of the United States, they carried with them more than just their personal belongings. They carried a mindset. It was a uniquely German way of seeing the world, forged in the fires of Prussian discipline and tempered by a national reverence for engineering. To these men, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the elite Afrika Korps, the world was a place of technical problems to be solved with superior design and flawless execution. And in the world of military vehicles, they believed they had already found the perfect solution. It was a small, unassuming, bucket-seated car they knew intimately. The Kubelwagen. Officially designated the TYP-82, the Kubelwagen was the brainchild of the brilliant automotive designer Ferdinand Porsche. It was born from the same project that would give Germany its iconic people's car, the Volkswagen Beetle. And it was the physical embodiment of the German engineering philosophy. It was not a brute. It was clever. It did not rely on overwhelming power, but on intelligent design. The Kubelwagen was air-cooled. This was not a minor detail. It was a stroke of genius. It meant there was no radiator to puncture, no coolant to freeze in the Russian winter, and no water to boil away in the African desert. It was incredibly lightweight. Weighing just over 700 kilograms, it could be lifted out of trouble by its own four-man crew. Its light weight, combined with a flat underbody, allowed it to ski across the deep sands of Libya and the thick mud of the Eastern Front, where heavier vehicles would bog down and sink. And it was a masterpiece of mechanical efficiency. At the heart of its design was a special hub reduction gear system. This clever piece of engineering gave the vehicle more torque and better ground clearance, allowing its two-wheel drive system to perform with the tenacity of a lesser four-wheel drive vehicle. To the German soldier, the Kubelwagen was not just a car. It was proof of concept. It was tangible evidence of German superiority. It was a vehicle that did more with less. It solved the problem of off-road military transport with intellect and precision, not with crude, brute force. It was a scalpel in a world of hammers. The men who drove it, the mechanics who maintained it, and the officers who commanded it, understood its strengths and weaknesses perfectly. They knew it was not invincible. But they believed it represented the pinnacle of its class, a perfect balance of durability, serviceability, and ingenious design. This was their frame of reference. This was the standard by which they judged all other military vehicles. It was a standard based on a belief that the best machine was the one that was most cleverly and precisely engineered. As these soldiers, now prisoners, traveled deep into the American heartland, they were about to encounter a machine born from a completely different philosophy. A philosophy they did not respect, did not understand, and were already primed to dismiss. They were about to meet the American Jeep. And in their expert, engineering-focused minds, there was no question as to which vehicle would be superior. They had built the best. The rest of the world was simply playing catch-up. The train journey across America was the German prisoners' first immersion into the staggering reality of the Allied war machine. They saw the endless factories, the packed rail yards, and the untouched prosperity of the American heartland. It was a profound and unsettling education in industrial scale. But when their journey ended and they arrived at the sprawling POW camps, places like Camp Hearn in Texas or Camp Alva in Oklahoma, they encountered the American war effort on a much smaller, more personal level. And it was here that their ingrained sense of engineering superiority resurfaced with a vengeance. The vehicle they saw everywhere, buzzing around the camp like a metallic insect, was the Willys MB, the American Jeep. Their first impressions were almost universally the same: contempt. To men accustomed to the sharp, utilitarian lines of the Kubelwagen, the Jeep looked absurd. It was a jumble of contradictions. It was short and stubby, with a high, almost awkward-looking profile. Its stamped front grille, with its vertical slats, resembled a cheap piece of farm equipment. The seats were simple canvas slings, appearing flimsy and uncomfortable. There was no elegance to its design, no sign of the sophisticated engineering they so admired. It looked crude. It looked cheap. And most damning of all, it looked like a toy. In the barracks, the German POWs, especially the veterans of motor pools and panzer divisions, would openly mock the little American vehicle. They would gather at the windows as a jeep bounced past and offer their expert critiques. "Look at it! A Feldwebel, a sergeant who had maintained a fleet of Kubelwagens in Tunisia, might say. There is no thought in the design. The body is just a steel box bolted to a frame. There are no doors, no proper roof. The soldiers are completely exposed to the elements. This is not a serious military vehicle." Another prisoner, an engineer by trade, would point out the engine. "It's water-cooled," he would scoff. "A single piece of shrapnel in the radiator, and the vehicle is useless. A foolish design for a combat vehicle. Our air-cooled engines are far superior." They called it the Blechspielzeug, the tin toy, or the Luxus cabriolet, the luxury convertible. This was their favorite point of mockery. The Jeep, to them, was a perfect symbol of the soft American soldier they had been taught about. It was a vehicle built not for hardship, but for convenience. It had four-wheel drive, a feature they saw not as a necessity, but as a crutch. A brute force solution to a problem that their own engineers had solved with lightweight design and clever gearing. A former Africa Corps NCO wrote in a secret diary, "The Americans need 4 powered wheels to pull their heavy, poorly designed car through the mud. Our Kubelwagen, which is much lighter, can cross the same terrain with only 2. They solve every problem with excess power and materials. There is no finesse, no intelligence, just brute force." This became the consensus. The Jeep was a crude, inefficient, and fundamentally unserious piece of equipment. It was a product of a nation that had too many resources and not enough brains. A nation that built expensive, complicated, luxury solutions for simple problems. They saw the Jeep not as a weapon, but as a symptom of the very weakness they believed would ultimately cause America to lose the war. Their laughter was confident, born from a deep and genuine belief in their own technical and philosophical superiority. They had seen the enemy's primary transport vehicle up close. And it was, in their expert opinion, a joke. Little did they know, their relationship with this tin toy was about to become much more intimate. And the joke, they would soon discover, was on them. Life in the American POW camps was, for the most part, a world of structured boredom. But under the Articles of the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war, with the exception of officers, could be put to work. America, with millions of its own men serving overseas, was facing a severe labor shortage, particularly in agriculture and raw materials. The German POWs were the solution. Across the country, they were organized into work details. They were sent to harvest cotton in Mississippi, cut lumber in the forests of Wisconsin, and repair railroad tracks in the Midwest. It was hard, physical labor, but it was also a welcome break from the monotony of the camp. It was a chance to be out in the world, to see the American countryside, and to feel a sense of purpose, however small. But for many of the prisoners, especially those with mechanical experience, this new chapter of their captivity came with a galling requirement. Their transportation to and from the work sites, their tool for hauling supplies, and their primary vehicle for any task outside the wire, was to be the very machine they so openly despised. The Willys MB Jeep. The reaction was one of collective, grumbling disdain. For a German mechanic who had lovingly maintained the precision-engineered engines of the Wehrmacht, being ordered to drive an American Jeep felt like an insult. It was like asking a master watchmaker to repair a cheap alarm clock. A former panzer crewman, a man who had commanded a sophisticated fighting machine, would now be forced to operate what he considered a flimsy toy. The American camp commanders, for their part, were utterly pragmatic. The Jeeps were plentiful, they were simple to operate, and they were tough. They were the perfect tool for the job. The Germans' condescending attitude was noted, but ultimately ignored. And so, with great reluctance, the POWs would assemble for their work details in the early morning light. A line of olive-drab Jeeps would be waiting for them, their American guards looking on with an air of casual indifference. A young private from Ohio might toss a set of keys to a German sergeant who had fought at El Alamein. "She's all yours, Fritz," the guard would say. Try not to break it. The German NCO would catch the keys, his face a mask of barely concealed contempt. The first moments behind the wheel were an exercise in culture shock. The seating position was upright and awkward. The controls were simple to the point of being primitive. The ride was bone-jarring. Everything about the vehicle felt crude and unsophisticated compared to the smooth, efficient feel of a Kubelwagen. "This is not a car," one prisoner wrote. "It is a tractor. It is a farm tool." They would drive them out of the camp gates, the little four-cylinder Go Devil engine buzzing loudly. They expected the worst. They expected them to be unreliable, to break down constantly. They expected them to get stuck, to be underpowered, to fail at the first serious challenge. Each sputtering engine, each rattle of the chassis, confirmed their pre-existing biases. The vehicle was a piece of cheap, mass-produced junk. It was a symbol of a nation that valued quantity over quality. Their initial task was often simple: driving down a paved or gravel road to a nearby farm or lumber camp. On these smooth surfaces, the Jeep performed adequately, but did nothing to change their opinion. It was functional. Nothing more. But the real test was not on the roads. The work that needed to be done was often far from any established path. It was out in the muddy fields, deep in the forests, and up the steep, ungraded tracks of the American wilderness. The American guards would point to a destination that seemed, to the German drivers, completely unreachable. A waterlogged field of sugar beets. A logging site on the other side of a stream. A supply dump at the top of a rain-slicked hill. The German drivers would shake their heads. "Impossible," they would say to each other in their own language. "The Kubelwagen could never make that. This tin toy will surely fail." With a deep sense of cynical expectation, they would shift the second, smaller lever on the floor of the Jeep. The lever that engaged the front axle. The lever that would provide the first brutal lesson in the difference between clever engineering and overwhelming capability. The first time a German POW drove a Jeep in true four-wheel drive, the world changed. All of the mockery, all of the engineering-based condescension, all of the confident assumptions, were about to collide with the simple, brutal physics of traction. The scene was repeated on work details across the country. Imagine a lumber camp in the Pacific Northwest. A steady week-long rain has turned the logging tracks into a river of deep, thick, unforgiving mud. An American guard, a young corporal from Oregon, points to a supply of crosscut saws and axes that need to be taken to a crew working on a hill half a mile away. The path is not a road. It is a soupy, rutted morass. The German driver, a veteran of the Eastern Front, looks at the path, then at the Jeep. He laughs and says in German to his comrades, "We will be stuck in 10 meters. The guard simply gestures for him to go. With a shrug of cynical resignation, the German engages the four-wheel drive. He presses the accelerator. And then, the revelation. The Jeep does not slip. It does not bog down. It lunges forward. The narrow tires, which had looked so inadequate, suddenly act like the claws of a wild animal. They dig into the mud, biting and tearing, finding traction where none should exist. The little Go Devil engine, which had sounded so unimpressive, delivers a steady, relentless stream of torque to all four wheels. The Jeep churns its way through the muck, throwing great arcs of mud into the air. It tilts at impossible angles, its chassis flexing, but it keeps moving forward. Inside the vehicle, the German prisoners are silent. Their mockery has been replaced by a stunned, wide-eyed disbelief. They are not just driving. They are witnessing a miracle of mechanical capability. This flimsy tin toy is moving through terrain that would have been an impassable graveyard for their lightweight, two-wheel drive Kubelwagen. Another scene, on a farm in the Mississippi Delta. A field of cotton, flooded by a sudden thunderstorm, needs to be reached. The ground is a slick, greasy layer of topsoil and water. The German prisoners are certain the task is impossible. The guard tells them to drive. They engage the four-wheel drive. The Jeep, with its high ground clearance and relentless traction, plows through the waterlogged field as if it were a paved road. It does not get stuck. It does not even slow down. Then, the ultimate test. A steep, rain-slicked hill on a construction project in the Appalachians. The grade is severe, a muddy slope that men can barely climb on foot. The German driver looks at his American guard as if he is insane. "Go on," the guard says. "Put it in low range." The prisoner shifts the transfer case into its lowest gear. The Jeep begins to crawl. The engine roars, but the vehicle moves at a walking pace, every ounce of power converted into unstoppable torque. It climbs the hill. It claws its way up the slick, muddy face, defying gravity, defying all of the Germans' carefully considered engineering principles. When they reach the top, the driver turns off the ignition. The prisoners sit in the sudden silence, their knuckles white on the grab handles. They look back down the impossible slope they have just conquered. In that moment, everything changes. This is not a luxury. This is not a toy. This is a weapon. They realize that the Americans had not used four-wheel drive as a crutch for a heavy, inefficient design. They had used it to create a vehicle with a level of off-road capability that was simply in a different universe from their own. They thought of the endless mud of the Rasputitsa on the Eastern Front, a sea of mire that had literally swallowed parts of the German army. They thought of the soft, deep sands of the Sahara, where their Kubelwagens, for all their cleverness, could still become hopelessly stuck. And they looked at this small, ugly, mass-produced American machine that could conquer it all. The laughter was gone, replaced by a chilling, profound, and deeply unsettling respect. The first part of their education was complete. The Jeep was not a joke. It was a prodigy, and they were only just beginning to understand the depth of its genius. The revelation of the Jeep's off-road prowess had shattered the German POWs' initial assessment. The vehicle was undeniably capable, but their engineering-focused minds still had questions. Capability was one thing. But what about durability? What about maintenance? German military equipment was often a paradox. It was brilliantly engineered, often to the highest performance standards. But this brilliance often came at the cost of complexity. A Panther tank's interleaved road wheels gave it a smooth ride, but replacing an inner wheel could take a maintenance crew an entire day. A Messerschmitt fighter's fuel-injected engine was a marvel, but it required specialist tools and highly trained technicians. German engineering often demanded German expertise to keep it running. The prisoners, therefore, expected the Jeep, with its seemingly powerful and complex four-wheel drive system, to be a maintenance nightmare. They watched it being abused day after day on their work details. They saw it driven by careless young guards who treated it with a complete lack of mechanical sympathy. They saw it overloaded with supplies, bounced over rocks, and run for hours on end in the heat and the cold. And they waited for it to fail. But it did not fail. The Jeeps just kept running. Day after day, week after week, they started, they ran, and they performed, with a level of monotonous reliability that was, to the Germans, perhaps even more shocking than their off-road capability. This prompted a new phase of their education. In the evenings, back at the camps, the mechanics and engineers among the prisoners would gather. Their conversations were no longer filled with mockery. They were filled with professional curiosity. How was this possible? What was the secret to this little vehicle's incredible toughness? When the opportunity arose, a Jeep in the motor pool for a simple oil change or tire repair, they would crowd around it. They would look under the hood. They would crawl underneath the chassis. And what they found was the second great revelation. The secret to the Jeep's reliability was a radical, almost brutal, simplicity. When they looked at the Go Devil engine, they did not find a complex, high-performance machine. They found a simple, low-compression, four-cylinder engine, based on a pre-war design for a civilian car. There was nothing sophisticated about it. But it was built from high-quality steel. It was easy to access. And it was famously understressed, meaning it could run reliably for thousands of hours without complaint. Everything was designed for easy access and repair. A German sergeant, a master mechanic, noted in a letter, "Today I watched an American guard replace a fuel pump on a Jeep. He was a boy, no older than 20. He was not a trained mechanic. He used 3 simple wrenches. The entire job took him 15 minutes. To perform a similar repair on one of our vehicles would require a trained specialist with a full toolkit, and it would take hours. This was the American philosophy laid bare. It was a design not for the perfect laboratory, but for the imperfect, muddy, and brutal reality of the field. It was a design that assumed the person fixing it was not a master craftsman, but a tired, cold, 19-year-old with a basic set of tools. And then they discovered the most profound secret of all: standardization. As they examined different Jeeps around the camp, some built by Willys Overland, others by Ford, they made a stunning discovery. The parts were identical. A starter motor from a Ford-built Jeep would fit perfectly into a Willys. A carburetor, a generator, a wheel hub, every component was completely and perfectly interchangeable. This was the miracle of the American production system. It was a level of mass-produced standardization that German industry, with its reliance on specialized workshops and competing manufacturers, had never achieved. For the German POWs, the implication was staggering. It meant that a single, universal pool of spare parts could service the entire fleet of hundreds of thousands of Jeeps. It meant that a damaged vehicle could be cannibalized for parts in the field to keep others running. It meant that the entire logistical and maintenance system was exponentially simpler and more efficient than their own. They were not just looking at a vehicle. They were looking at a complete, integrated, and brilliantly pragmatic system of manufacturing, maintenance, and logistics. The Jeep wasn't a luxury. It was the most brutally practical and reliable machine they had ever seen. The respect that had been born in the mud was now solidified in the motor pool. The German engineers, the men of logic and precision, had been presented with a new set of facts. And the facts were undeniable. The flimsy American toy was an engineering masterpiece. Not of complexity, but of simplicity. Not of specialized perfection, but of rugged, universal reliability. The German POWs education in the genius of the Jeep was not yet complete. They had been converted by its all-terrain capability. They had been convinced by its rugged simplicity and reliability. Now, they were about to witness its most surprising characteristic of all: its almost limitless versatility. To the German military mind, a vehicle was designed for a purpose. A Kubelwagen was a Kubelwagen, a bucket car for transporting troops. A Kettenkrad was a half-tracked motorcycle for towing light guns and laying cable. Each machine had a specific, designated role. It was a specialist. The Jeep, the prisoners quickly learned, was not a specialist. It was a universal tool. A mechanical soldier of all arms. On their work details, they began to see the little vehicle used in ways that defied their rigid definitions of what a car was supposed to do. On a farm in Georgia, a Jeep's bumper is hitched to a plow. With its relentless four-wheel drive traction, it digs furrows in the tough soil, performing the work of a small tractor. The German prisoners, sent to a field to plant potatoes, watch in amazement. Their own army had a multitude of specialized tractors. The Americans just used a Jeep. At a lumber camp in Minnesota, a power takeoff unit has been fitted to a Jeep's transfer case. A thick belt runs from the Jeep to a massive circular saw. The Jeep's engine, which was designed to move the vehicle, is now powering industrial machinery. Its steady buzz the sound of logs being turned into lumber. The prisoners, tasked with stacking the wood, can only shake their heads. They had never conceived of a car being used as a mobile power station. Then they see the endless military applications around the camps and in newsreels. They see a Jeep with a heavy, .50 caliber Browning machine gun mounted on a pedestal in the back. The simple transport car has been transformed into a fast, aggressive weapons platform. A tank killer. A scourge of enemy aircraft. They see a Jeep with its windscreen folded down and a massive radio set bolted in the passenger's area. It is now a mobile command post, a vital communications link keeping generals in contact with the front lines. They see a Jeep with stretchers fitted over the back, its bone-jarring ride a small price to pay for its ability to go deep into the battlefield and retrieve wounded men that a normal ambulance could never reach. It is now a lifeline. They see it acting as a scout car, a snowplow with a blade attached, an artillery tractor for light cannons, and even an impromptu locomotive, fitted with special wheels to pull train cars along damaged railway lines. The list of its adaptations was endless, limited only by the ingenuity of the GIs who used it. One prisoner, a former lieutenant, wrote a letter home that was intercepted by American censors. In it, he tried to explain the phenomenon of the Jeep to his family. "You must understand," he wrote, "this is not merely a car. It is a concept." The Americans do not see a vehicle with a single purpose. They see a mobile engine with 4 wheels. And they ask themselves, what can we make this engine do today? The answer seems to be, anything. This was a profound philosophical difference. German engineering often sought to create the perfect, specialized tool for a single, specific task. American engineering sought to create a simple, adaptable, good enough tool that could then be modified to do 100 different tasks. The German approach resulted in masterpieces of specialized design. The American approach resulted in a tool that could solve any problem the battlefield presented. The prisoners began to understand that the Jeep's simple, boxy shape was not a sign of poor design. It was a blank canvas. Its basic, rugged nature was not a weakness. It was the source of its infinite adaptability. It was a wrench, a hammer, a saw, and a lifeline, all rolled into one small, olive-drab package. The respect the POWs felt for the vehicle was now complete. They had seen it conquer the terrain. They had seen it defy mechanical failure. And now they saw it perform an impossible number of roles. But the final, and most crushing, part of their education was still to come. It was a lesson not in engineering, but in simple, brutal, and unforgiving mathematics. The German POWs were now true converts. They understood the Jeep's capability, its reliability, and its versatility. They had developed a grudging, professional respect for the machine. In their minds, it was now a worthy rival to their own Kubelwagen. A different philosophy perhaps, but a respectable piece of engineering nonetheless. But they still viewed the conflict in terms of a one-to-one comparison. They thought of it as a duel, the Kubelwagen versus the Jeep. They were about to learn that it was not a duel. It was an avalanche. The revelation did not come in a single, dramatic moment. It was a slow, creeping realization, built from dozens of small, seemingly insignificant observations. It started with the conversations with the guards. A German prisoner, making small talk with a young American corporal, might ask where he was from. "Kenosha, Wisconsin," the guard might reply. "And what do they make in Kenosha?" the prisoner would ask. "Engines," the guard would say. "Among other things. My brother works at the Nash Kelvinator plant. They build the engines for the bombers." Another day, another guard. This one from Toledo, Ohio. His father worked at the Willys Overland plant. "What do they build there?" the German would ask, already knowing the answer. "Jeeps," the guard would say with a shrug. "Just Jeeps. Thousands of them. Thousands." The number was noted, but perhaps dismissed as patriotic exaggeration. Then, a work detail is sent to a regional army supply depot to load lumber. As they arrive, they see a field. It is not a field of grass. It is a field of Jeeps. Hundreds upon hundreds of them, parked in perfect endless rows, gleaming under the American sun. They are waiting for shipment. To England. To Russia. To the Pacific. The prisoners fall silent, their eyes trying to process the scale of what they are seeing. This is not a single company's motor pool. This is the casual overflow of a single factory, in a single month. The true, mind-numbing numbers were often revealed in the American magazines the prisoners were sometimes allowed to read. A copy of Life or the Saturday Evening Post, filled with advertisements celebrating the power of American industry. An ad for the Ford Motor Company. It would boast of the company's incredible production achievements since converting to war manufacturing. And there, in the fine print, A German engineer among the POWs would see the number. A number so large, so completely outside his frame of reference, that he would have to read it multiple times to be sure he was not mistaken. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 640,000 Jeeps. 640,000. The German prisoners knew their own production numbers intimately. They were a source of national pride. The total production of the Kubelwagen, over its entire wartime run, from 1940 to 1945, was approximately 50,000. 50,000. The prisoners would write these two numbers down on scraps of paper. 640,000 versus 50,000. The ratio was almost 13 to 1. For every single, cleverly engineered Kubelwagen that rolled out of the Volkswagen factory, America was producing 13 rugged, versatile, and brutally effective Jeeps. This was the moment of ultimate, crushing realization. This was the unforgiving math that ended all debate. Their admiration for the Jeep's quality was now rendered almost irrelevant by the terrifying, overwhelming reality of its quantity. It was no longer about which vehicle was better. The question was meaningless. It was like asking if a single handcrafted hunting rifle is better than 1,000 mass-produced machine guns. A former German staff officer, interned at Camp Clinton, Mississippi, wrote a secret analysis for his fellow officers. "Our entire perception of this conflict has been flawed," he wrote. "We have been judging the war as a contest of engineering quality and tactical skill. It is not. It is a contest of industrial production. And in that contest, we are not just losing. We are irrelevant." We laughed at their little Jeep. We called it a toy. But the Americans are not building one toy. They are building a deluge of them. They are burying us under a mountain of steel, a mountain of tires, a mountain of engines. And the Jeep is just one small part of that mountain. The German POWs now understood. Their personal journey with the Jeep, from mockery to respect, was a microcosm of the entire war. They had been focused on the quality of a single tree, while the Americans had planted an entire, continent-sized forest. And that forest was about to consume them all. The revelation of the production numbers was a psychological breaking point. The sheer, brutal mathematics of it, 640,000 versus 50,000, ended any lingering debate about the Jeep itself. But for the more thoughtful prisoners, the engineers, the officers, and the industrial managers now in captivity, this realization was simply the gateway to a much deeper, and far more disturbing, understanding. The Jeep was not the phenomenon. The phenomenon was the system that created it. The little car was merely a symptom of a power so vast, so profound, that it defied their entire experience of the world. They began to connect the dots. Every observation they had made since arriving in America now clicked into place, forming a single, terrifying picture. They thought back to the train journey. The endless factories they had seen, running day and night, were not just building Jeeps. They were building everything. The tanks, the planes, the ships, the rifles, the ammunition, the uniforms. The Jeep was just one standardized product among thousands, flowing from a production system of almost incomprehensible scale. A prisoner, who had been a factory manager in Stuttgart, explained it to his comrades in the barracks. "To build one Jeep," he said, "is not so difficult. But to build 640,000 of them, all identical, all with perfectly interchangeable parts, requires something we do not have. It requires a complete mastery of mass production. It requires thousands of subcontractors, all working to the same exact tolerances. It requires a supply chain that can deliver millions of tons of steel, rubber, and glass to the right place, at the right time, without fail. We are not fighting a vehicle. We are fighting the American factory." Then they considered the resources. Germany's war effort was a constant, desperate struggle for raw materials. Oil from Romania. Iron ore from Sweden. Rubber and tungsten from the Far East. Every campaign was, in part, a raid for the resources needed to continue the war. The Jeep was a physical manifestation of American resource wealth. Its body was made of high-quality American steel, from the iron ranges of Minnesota. Its tires were made from rubber, once from Asia, now synthetically produced in colossal new factories or sourced from South America. Its engine was lubricated with oil drawn from the endless fields of Texas and Oklahoma. Its electrical systems hummed with the power of American copper. One prisoner bitterly remarked, "We fight wars to acquire resources. The Americans have the resources to fight wars." The Jeep, in its material composition, was a map of a self-sufficient continent. A continent that was not just a nation, but a self-contained industrial ecosystem. And then there was the most demoralizing realization of all. The factory that built the Jeep, the mine that produced its steel, the oil field that supplied its fuel, all of it operated in a state of absolute, untouchable peace. While German factories in Essen and Hamburg were being systematically pounded into rubble by Allied bombers, the Willys Overland factory in Toledo was running 3 shifts a day under bright, peaceful skies. While German workers scrambled for bomb shelters, American workers were worrying about hitting their production quotas. This was the ultimate asymmetry of the war. America was a fortress of production, a vast, invulnerable arsenal, completely immune to attack. Germany was a besieged workshop, trying to build weapons while its own roof was caving in. The German prisoners, sitting in their safe, well-fed camps in the middle of this fortress, saw this truth with a clarity their commanders in Berlin could not, or would not, accept. The Jeep was no longer just a car. It had become a symbol. It was a symbol of a system that could train a farmer's son to fix a standardized engine with 3 simple wrenches. It was a symbol of a system that could produce a deluge of machines from a bottomless well of raw materials. It was a symbol of a system that could wage a total, industrial war from a place of complete and total safety. The prisoners had started by laughing at a piece of hardware. They now found themselves in terrified awe of the entire industrial, economic, and geographical reality that hardware represented. They had mistaken the tip of the spear for the spear itself. Now, they understood. They were not just fighting the United States Army. They were fighting the United States of America. And it was a fight they had already lost. The change was not loud. It was quiet. It was the silence that fell over the barracks in the evenings. The once lively debates, the confident technical arguments, the shared laughter at the expense of American engineering, it all just stopped. The mockery of the Jeep had been a source of comfort for the German POWs. It was a small but important way for them to reaffirm their identity and their belief in German superiority, even in the midst of defeat and captivity. It was a psychological anchor, a reminder of the world they came from, a world where they were the masters of technology and design. Now, that anchor had been ripped away. The men who had been the most vocal critics, the most confident experts, were the ones who now fell the most silent. The sergeants from the motor pools, the mechanics who could strip down a Maybach engine blindfolded, the lieutenants from the panzer divisions who understood the intricacies of gear ratios and armor plating. These were the men who truly understood the horrifying implications of what they had learned. They had not just been wrong about a car. They had been fundamentally wrong about the very principles of modern warfare. Their entire professional worldview, a lifetime of training and experience, had been invalidated. Imagine a young German NCO, a mechanic who had always taken immense pride in his work. He remembered the long hours spent in the freezing mud of Russia, carefully repairing a complex piece of German machinery, feeling like a surgeon saving a life. His skill, his expertise had mattered. Now, he watched as an American guard, faced with a broken-down Jeep, simply unbolted the entire engine, lifted it out with a small crane, and dropped a brand new one in its place. The whole process took less than an hour. The American approach wasn't about repairing. It was about replacing. The individual vehicle was not precious. It was disposable. The German mechanic realized that his specialized, hard-won skill, a source of immense pride, was obsolete in the face of this new, brutal logic of mass production and interchangeability. The silence was the sound of a painful, private reassessment taking place in the minds of thousands of men. They replayed every battle, every campaign, but now through this new, terrifying lens of industrial reality. They remembered watching their own supply trucks being strafed and destroyed on the roads to Stalingrad, and they knew that for every truck they lost, the Americans were building 100 more. They remembered the desperate shortages of spare parts that had crippled half their panzer division before a major battle. And they now understood that somewhere in America, there was a warehouse the size of a city, filled with every conceivable part, ready to be shipped. They remembered their own Kubelwagen, a vehicle they had loved for its cleverness. And they now saw it for what it was, a boutique, almost artisanal product from a small workshop, pitted against the relentless, overwhelming output of a continent-sized factory. The regret was palpable. It was the regret of an expert who realizes he has been clinging to an outdated and romantic notion. The regret of a duelist who has proudly brought a perfectly crafted rapier to a fight, only to be met by an opponent with a machine gun. A German officer, in a conversation with a camp's commanding officer, tried to articulate this feeling. "We saw the Jeep, and we judged it by our standards," he said. "We judged it as engineers. We looked for elegance, for innovation, for technical brilliance. We were fools. We should not have been judging it as engineers. We should have been judging it as soldiers. Because as a tool of war, as one piece of an entire system designed to crush an enemy, it is perfect. We laughed at a vehicle that represented everything we lacked. Mass production, standardization, simplicity, reliability, and an infinite supply of everything. The laughter in the barracks was gone for good. It had been replaced by the quiet, contemplative, and deeply unnerving silence of men who had finally been forced to understand the true nature of their defeat. They were not just prisoners of war. They were relics of a bygone era of warfare, left to contemplate the new, terrifying age of industrial annihilation that the humble little Jeep had so perfectly revealed to them. The silence in the barracks was the sound of a private defeat. But over time, that silent reflection gave way to conversation. The talk was different now. The mockery was gone, replaced by a grudging, professional analysis. Men who had once dismissed the Jeep as a toy now spoke of it with the focused, dispassionate respect one expert gives to the work of another. These were the voices of the converted. Listen to the words of a former Feldwebel, a master sergeant from a Panzer Grenadier division, speaking to a younger prisoner. "You look at this Jeep, and you see a simple car. That is the mistake we all made. You must look at it as a weapon like a rifle or a machine gun. Ask yourself, what makes a good weapon? It is not complexity. It is reliability. It is the guarantee that when you pull the trigger, it will fire. Every single time. This Jeep, it always fires. It always starts. In the cold, in the heat, in the mud. It does not care. It starts." That is a quality our own machines, for all their brilliance, did not always have. That is a weapon. Another conversation, between two men who had been mechanics in the Afrika Korps. "Do you remember in Libya?" one asked the other. "The sand. So fine it was like dust. It got into everything. The fuel lines, the carburetors, the bearings. We spent more time cleaning our engines than we did fighting. I have been watching these Jeeps. They operate in the dust of the Texas plains, which is just as bad. They never stop. The air filters, the seals, the design is basic. But it is sealed. It is protected. They thought about the dust. We thought about performance. They thought about failure. And they built a machine that simply refused to fail." One of the most powerful conversions was that of a sergeant who had been in charge of a Kubelwagen motor pool on the Eastern Front. He was a man who loved the cleverness of Porsche's design. But the brutal reality of that war had taught him a different lesson. "Our Kubelwagen," the sergeant began, "was a fine vehicle for a parade. It was clever. It made our engineers feel proud. But on the third day of a battle, when it is raining and you are running out of fuel and the spare parts you need are 1,000 kilometers away, that cleverness becomes a curse. That is when you need a stupid car," he said, tapping his temple. A car that is too stupid to know that it is supposed to break down. A car that any farm boy can fix with a hammer and a piece of wire. A car that you can pour any kind of fuel into, and it will still run. That was the Jeep. It was not a clever car. It was a stupid, stubborn, magnificent car. A true soldier's car. Even high-ranking officers, who were exempt from labor but observed the Jeeps daily, were converted. An Oberst, a colonel, who had been captured in Normandy, reflected on the difference in philosophy. "We Germans, we love to build a perfect machine," he said. "Our tanks, our airplanes, they were often the best in the world. Individually. But war is not about the best machine. It is about the machine that is there." The Americans understood this. They did not build the perfect scout car. They built a simple, good enough scout car. And then they built 600,000 of them. Their quality was not in the perfection of the individual unit, but in the perfection of the production line. This is the war we were fighting. A war of production lines. And we brought our engineering workshops to the fight. It was a battle we could never win. These were the voices of the converted. Men who had arrived in America confident in their own superiority, armed with a lifetime of experience that told them they were right. And they were met with a small, ugly, unassuming vehicle that systematically, and relentlessly, proved them wrong. It was a humbling, and for many, a deeply bitter education. They had learned to respect the Jeep. But in doing so, they had been forced to accept the undeniable, industrial logic of their own nation's defeat. The war ended. The factories that had churned out a deluge of steel and fire fell silent, and then began to retool for a world at peace. The German prisoners of war, their education complete, were eventually repatriated, returning to a country that was a landscape of rubble and ruin. They brought back with them the haunting, first-hand knowledge of the industrial colossus that had defeated them. And the two vehicles at the heart of their story, the Jeep and the Kubelwagen, also returned from the war, forever changed by the conflict that had defined them. Their post-war journeys would become an echo of the very philosophies that had created them. The Kubelwagen, for all practical purposes, was dead. Its production had ceased in 1945. It was a purely military vehicle, a ghost of a defeated army. But its brilliant DNA, the engineering genius of Ferdinand Porsche, was resurrected from the ashes of the Volkswagen factory. The air-cooled engine, the simple chassis, the rugged suspension, all of it was reborn in a new, civilian body. The Volkswagen Beetle. The Beetle was the Kubelwagen's peaceful twin. It was everything the Kubelwagen had been, but stripped of its aggression. It was cheap, efficient, and incredibly reliable. It became the car that put post-war Germany back on wheels. It was a symbol not of conquest, but of the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. The Kubelwagen's ghost had found a second life as a global icon of peace, practicality, and clever, minimalist design. It was a quiet, enduring victory for the German engineering mindset. The Jeep's journey was different. It did not have a ghost. It had a legacy. The war had made the Jeep arguably the most famous vehicle on the planet. GI's returning home had fallen in love with its rugged, can-do attitude. And the Willys Overland Company, seeing an opportunity, created a civilian version. The CJ-2A. The first civilian Jeep. They painted it in bright, friendly colors instead of olive drab. They marketed it to farmers and ranchers as the perfect all-purpose tool, a car that could plow a field on Monday and take the family to church on Sunday. But the Jeep could not be contained by the farm. Its spirit, the spirit of freedom, of adventure, of going anywhere and doing anything, had captured the world's imagination. It became a symbol of American rugged individualism. It spawned an entire culture, an entire industry of off-road recreation. While the Beetle was designed for the road, the Jeep was designed for the places where there were no roads. Its legacy was not just in one car, but in every single sport utility vehicle and four-wheel drive truck that would follow. It had not just created a vehicle, it had created a category. In a strange, ironic twist, the two vehicles continued their philosophical rivalry in peacetime. The Beetle was the champion of clever, efficient, on-road design. The Jeep was the champion of rugged, go-anywhere, brute force capability. The German prisoners who had returned home would have seen this playing out. They would have watched the little beetles begin to fill the new roads of a rebuilt Germany, a quiet testament to their nation's engineering resilience. And they would have seen newsreels and magazines from America, showing smiling families in their brightly colored Jeeps, exploring mountains and deserts, embodying a spirit of freedom and boundless possibility. It was a post-war echo of the very debate they had once held in the barracks. Was it better to be clever and efficient, or rugged and overwhelmingly capable? The war had provided one answer. The peace would prove to be more complicated. But for the men who had been there, who had driven both, the memory of the Jeep's wartime performance was an undeniable truth. It was the little car that had not only conquered the battlefield, but had also conquered the hearts and minds of its most ardent and expert critics. No single rifle, no single tank, and no single soldier ever wins a war. Modern warfare is a brutal, complex equation of a million different factors. It is a contest of strategy, of courage, of logistics, and of will. But if you had to choose a single machine, a single piece of olive-drab hardware, to serve as a perfect microcosm of why the Allies won the Second World War, you could do no better than the Willys MB Jeep. The journey of the German prisoner of war is the ultimate proof. They were the perfect test subjects. They were expert, biased, and deeply skeptical witnesses. They arrived in America as true believers in a philosophy of specialized, engineering perfection. And they left as converts, bearing the humbling, first-hand knowledge of a different, and ultimately more powerful, creed. The creed of mass-produced, reliable, and overwhelming quantity. The Jeep was the sermon that converted them. It was a sermon delivered in the mud of a waterlogged field. It was a sermon preached in the brutal simplicity of a standardized engine part. It was a sermon written in the unforgiving mathematics of the production line. The German POWs had laughed at the Jeep because it was not a product of their world. It was not a machine that valued precision over practicality, or complexity over reliability. They were right. It was a product of a world that was simply bigger. A world with more steel, more oil, more rubber, and more factories. A world that could afford to solve problems with a brute force that the Germans could only dream of. In the end, the Jeep taught them the most important lesson of the industrial age. The race is not always to the most clever. It is to the most relentless. General George C. Marshall, the architect of the American military, called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who lived and died with the frontline soldiers, said of the Jeep, "It did everything. It went everywhere. It was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It consistently carried twice what it was designed for, and still kept going." But perhaps the most powerful testament did not come from an American general or a famous reporter. It came from the quiet, grudging respect of its enemies. It came from the German sergeant who called it a magnificent, stupid car. It came from the German colonel who realized that the quality was not in the unit, but in the production line. It came from the thousands of German soldiers who had started by laughing at a tin toy, and ended by understanding that they were looking at the very symbol of their own defeat. The story of the German POWs and the Jeep is more than just an anecdote. It is an allegory. It is the story of how a war fought between nations became a war fought between factories. It is the story of how the romantic ideal of the perfectly engineered weapon was rendered obsolete by the pragmatic reality of the perfectly organized assembly line. The German soldiers were right to be proud of their Kubelwagen. It was a masterpiece of clever design. But the Americans didn't just design a vehicle. They designed a system. A system of production. A system of logistics. A system of victory. And the humble, ugly, indomitable, and endlessly versatile little Jeep was the emissary of that system. It was the little car that didn't just win a battle. In its own small way, it explained why Germany had already lost the war.